Welcome to the Dennis Report. I'm Dennis Atchison. The Olympics in Rio were held just a few months ago, and we had a large piece of New Brunswick there to help make sure it was successful for all the athletes representing Canada. Our guest today is going to walk us behind the scenes at what happens at an Olympics and the connection between high-level performance sport and large-scale participation and the impact of sport on our culture. Our guest today is Dermer Norris. She has worked behind the scenes in the Canadian Olympic movement for a long time and had her start with the Canada Games back in '85. I believe her official title is Games
Specialist,
which sounds like a pretty general title for specialist. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thanks for taking the time. So Rio was just a little while ago, a few months back, and you started your journey in '85 at the Canada Games in St. John, New Brunswick.
Yes, I did.
It's if you were to mark spots on a map from Rio to back to Canada Games, that's quite the journey.
It is. Very, very fortunate in the province. We hosted those games, as you know, in 1985, and it's a rotation across Canada, hosting of the games. And so it was New Brunswick's turn, and St. John won the bid and did an exceptional job. And it was my first experience of a multi-sport event. Prior to that, it was like single sport. I come from the sport of rowing, and it was going to national championships, provincial championships, and so on, but single sport focus.
Yep.
So this was a bit of an eye-opener for me, there as a volunteer and as a participant.
Yep. I'm thinking the audience we need to frame you up a little bit here. So go to Rio, please.
Yes.
And what is it that you do now? Because it's behind the scenes and people just won't have a clue how much goes on behind the scenes in order for that athlete to perform to their best.
My career has evolved over the years, but I would say my forte has been in the area of games operations for the Canadian Olympic Committee.
Okay.
So every single National Olympic Committee that goes to the Games has a responsibility from a logistics operational perspective to get the team there, to manage their day-to-day activity, to also provide services to ensure that athletes perform to the best of their abilities. So we basically mobilize a MASH unit is the best way to describe it, in the area of health and science, communications, technology. We provide support for athlete services, for coaching services. And what we do is we complement what the organizing committee provides on site. So they have a responsibility to house the athletes, to feed the athletes, to ensure that they have transportation to and from their venue, to have first-class venues on site for fair competition. They do provide certain services on site, such as healthcare services and so on, but what we do is we complement what they provide. So we have the responsibility to fly our athletes to the games, to outfit them at the games, to provide them with support so that we're minimizing any distractions so that they could compete to the best of their abilities.
Well, the public in general terms know the Olympic story best through the athlete, because that's what media will follow the athlete's progression.
Correct.
And as we understand that story, you'll have, like working backwards, if it's a 100-meter final for men or women or any of the track events or any of them, it's geared to, I'm competing at 2 o'clock on Saturday at, on this track, the humidity is going to be this, and they work everything backwards, almost 8 years now, to when that moment in time will come to try. So any divergence off of that training path or that intention to have absolute peak performance at that one narrow window of time is phenomenal.
Absolutely.
So you can easily picture if any of us travel and you're somewhere else for 2 weeks or 5 days, and you're eating different food, or your sleep patterns off, or all of that can really knock that schedule of 8 years worth of work.
Yeah.
Crazy.
And Dennis, there was a time when the Canadian Olympic Committee, which used to be called the Canadian Olympic Association, so I'm dating myself here,
Yeah.
when I was first involved, where our involvement with athletes and coaches was, pretty much every 4 years, alternating winter, summer Olympics. And our focus again was logistics and, like air travel agencies, so to speak,
Yeah.
And in 2004, at the Athens Games, we had anticipated some pretty big performances of our athletes because we had just come off of a very, very successful World Championship quad. And so we went into those games with really high expectations, as did our national sport federations and the athletes themselves. And we fell short in Athens. And so we took a look back. We did an evaluation of that.
Okay.
And we looked back and we said, what is it that our athletes need to get onto the podium? Like, these are world champions going to an Olympic Games and not delivering.
Yeah.
So met with the athletes, had a really, really good session with them in terms of what it was. And basically, I don't think we came to the conclusion, we just realized that the Olympic environment is very different than going to a world championship.
Yeah, because that's single sport. World Championship will tend to be single sport.
Yes.
And different obligations maybe on the part of the organizers, or more ability of the athlete to control their variables.
Environment, absolutely.
Yeah, compared to an Olympics thing where now
Yeah.
you've got this other obligation or contract that
Right.
when you're going to participate, you've got
Right.
a certain schedule that you don't get to control as much.
So an athlete will go to a world championship surrounded by their team, and it'll be their coaches, their sports psychologists, their trainer, their doctor, their technician. I mean, there's a whole group of them that support the athlete. They get accredited at the World Championship. There's no limitations in that respect. They'll probably stay in a hotel. They have access to their family and friends. The media aren't as prevalent as you see at an Olympic Games.
Yeah.
But when they go into the Olympic environment, all of a sudden, their team, their direct support team is minimal because we have limited accreditations afforded to us by an organizing committee. And so we have to get the sports to prioritize who they would send to the games.
Well, just in the way you gave us that wonderful description, if each athlete had a support team of 8 to 10 people, and then imagine all the athletes that go to Olympics and they all bring 8 to 10 people.
Correct.
I know in team sports it's not quite the case, but
Correct.
it'd be a phenomenal amount of space and resources needed. So I can understand the need for the paring down. Quick divergence. You talked about Athens, and we didn't perform as well as we could.
Right.
One of the things that always comes up around Olympics is performance based on medals. And if that's the way it is, then that's okay. But is that the way it is? Because media will justify it based on medal count. And they'll do that box, and they'll give you the grid, and Canada's got so many of those, and here we are out of the world. It's never prorated based on population size or the number of people in that particular sport.
Right, exactly.
So you never get a context for what that medal means.
Yeah, and it's a point that we actually brought up during our past debrief in terms of comparing us to bigger countries like the U.S. or China or whatever, right? I mean, we'll never attain what the Americans are attaining, just as you said, population size.
Yeah.
And the qualification to go to an Olympics is a journey in itself, so making that Olympic team as Canadians and qualifying specifically team sports is an achievement in itself. And athletes will say, the journey to get there to them is podium performance in their eyes, right? Those are some of the things that we're looking at as well too. And, being on the podium is just that little bit of extra. How many fourth place finishes we have, so.
Yeah, there was a track lady who 800 meters, I think it was. Anyway, so close. There were so many performances that's so close.
Right.
So
Right.
exciting to watch them perform to that level, and then it's just that day.
Yeah.
And it's just the way the race is going to shake out that day.
Exactly. And so our role over the years have evolved, from being that logistics support to actually being a performance partner with the national sport federations and the athletes. And the athletes came back and said they need to be better prepared for that Olympic environment. We also have to help them minimize distraction, once they're on site. So we do invest quite a bit and support our national sport federations in doing familiarization visits. So they'll actually go to the country at least once.
Oh, that's good.
Where they're going to be competing, before they get there, to have a good understanding of the lay of the land, what the games environment's going to be, the culture of the country. You mentioned food.
Yeah, well,
Again, that's another thing,
it's
right?
such a core piece because they'll even count right down to the calorie.
Yeah.
What they need and what type of food they need at one point in time. If anyone's done
Correct.
any kind of athletics at all,
Yeah.
carbo loading here, or need protein stuff there,
Yeah.
or need this sleep pattern to let that body metabolize it so that you're loaded, your body's ready to
Right.
go now.
Right.
And familiarizing with the environment sounds cool too, because having done sports in our past and stuff, walking into the stadium, walking around on the surface,
Right.
seeing what the track is like, whether it's cycling
Yeah.
or for the pool, the acoustics in the pool,
Yeah.
all that environmental stuff is so important to orient him. So
Right.
this is sort of a new piece in the puzzle where the athletes get to go
Yeah.
and sound it out.
Yeah, and that's the shift in our thinking in terms of, what do we want to do to support them to the best of our abilities to support them. And these things came out. So we do media training with them before they get to the games, We host Olympic Excellence Series where we bring in largely the medal potential athletes. We usually widen that a little bit more, but to sit down and talk to their counterparts from other sports, because they could learn from each other.
Sure.
We bring in retired athletes to speak to them about, the good things that have happened to them, also the bad things that have happened to them, and it's good. It's okay if you don't succeed, there's this fear, I think, with some of the rookie athletes that there's so much pressure on them, they're representing their club, the province, Canada, the support of their families, and you see them many times when they're interviewed and they fall apart, because they feel they've let the country down.
Yeah,
Oh my
no,
gosh.
it's the other way. Yes, that's a key piece in the shift in the kind of energy. So we will have many athletes, especially winter sports, although winter sports is starting to gain more media attention for that shift. So character like Mark Fossett,
Yes.
who originally came out of St. John, I believe.
Yes, he did.
And stories about him before an Olympic event. So he's one of the founders of snowboarding and competitive snowboarding,
Right.
tweaking the equipment, all that lovely stuff. Lives in a cabin up in the mountains on like 12,000 a year, and he's got people help. But come Olympic time, suddenly he's in the spotlight. He's the one to beat. He's the one to set the standard that everyone looks up to.
Right.
So that shift in attention must be phenomenal from scraping by below the poverty line.
Yeah.
And then you're expected to win a gold medal. And unfortunately in Vancouver, I think it was, his equipment popped on.
It was 98 Nagano.
Okay.
That had happened.
Yeah.
And it was really unfortunate. It was the first time that their sport was included, and so there was even that much more hype and attention for them. But it was really interesting because I had the opportunity, I was a volunteer at the time working on the mission team, and I was in the Olympic Village and knew he was going to be there because he had made the team, and we connected and gave me a big hug. And anyway, and he said, "Betty, I want to thank you for the work that you've done." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he says, "Back in 1985, when I was the team manager, going back to the Canada Games and the importance of the Canada Games movement in Canada." And he said, I know I was a difficult athlete, and he was a bit of a hellion, but
Yeah.
you know, he
Snowboarder.
had that little edge, right, that made him a true competitor and a medalist, you know, at Canada Games.
Yeah.
And he said, you were so strict with us, you had rules and regulations, and you explained things to us in terms of, what the parameters were with respect to being a high performance athlete. And he said, I didn't understand it at the time. I got frustrated at the time.
Yeah.
He says, but now he was the only one on his team that had experienced that multi-sport games experience. So him coming into the Olympic Village, dealing with the media, dealing with that environment was somewhat second nature to him compared to some of his, athletes, other athletes on the team that didn't have that experience. So he was prepared, right? So that whole preparation piece is really critical.
And I pulled us away from talking about food.
Yes.
Because we were going to get into that. So I can imagine at Rio, there must be kitchens set up so each country's got a version of their typical food or their native food.
Mm-hmm.
Or is it that everybody eats the local fare somehow?
The organizing committee has a responsibility to provide the basic staples that would cover all continents, basically. So, they have to make sure that they have that type of variety, that the food is fresh, lots of vegetables, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So they do have that responsibility, and that's something the IOC looks at very carefully when they do a series of inspections, basically, leading up to the games to make sure that whichever food provider is providing that array of menu for the athletes. But this is where, again, we complement where the organizing committee may fall short. So athletes today are gluten-free, vegan, vegetarian, you name it. They're a little bit more specific in terms of what their requirements are. And so we will ship. We work with each national sport federation to identify which athletes are at risk of not having, the proper quality of food that they require. We work with a nutritionist who's assigned to the team, basically, leading up to the game. So she meets with the organizing committee and she reviews their menu choices and so on. We also need to take into consideration that we have some athletes that might be living off-site, so they're not in the village and they don't have access to that food, and so we develop individualized plans for those athletes as well. So really, really critical. Water, always an issue, and the organizing committee did a great job in Rio in providing bottled water and so on at the venues and both in the village. But those are some of the things that we do. It becomes part of our cargo plan.
Yes.
Many months before the games, before we get there.
Yeah.
So like 3 to 4 months out, we're shipping loads and loads, pallets of it. As a matter of fact, I kept an email that I received from our cargo people in terms of what we packed. So we packed 126 pallets weighing 28,025 kilos that filled 6 truckloads, of equipment and food and our outfitting operations, so we do this so many months leading out to the games to ensure that we have everything on site. Yeah.
This is wonderful because most of the audience will only get what NBC or CBC or TSN will provide. So you'll hear stories of the American basketball team renting a yacht and having private chefs and all that stuff, which is one far end of the spectrum. But we never get the inside story. We have a vague image of what happens in Olympic Village, what happens in Canada House, and that there's got to be some food provided. But the only other food story we heard out of the Olympics was at the venues, not for the athletes, but no food at the venues. But people being people will associate it back thinking, oh my goodness, I hope the athletes have their food. So this is great behind the scenes story to how well we've taken care of our people, which then translates to performance.
Rio was a bit of an anomaly, as we know. They won the bid over 7 years ago at a time when the state of the economy of the country was on the rise, And they deliver a phenomenal games given the circumstance and the challenges that they had placed in front of them. And there were areas where they had to definitely cut back, you know, and so is it more important to feed your athletes in the village or that spectator that's looking for that chocolate bar, you know, at the venue, you know? So yeah, you're absolutely right.
And that's just the way it goes, and maybe people need to have a touch of grace. Most of the time media likes the conflict story, and so they had more than their share of those out of the Olympics this time. So it's nice to know the other side, where the cooperation was kicking in, people were planning in advance, it was going as planned. It wasn't disaster management, it was actually a high-functioning games. With the great point you make that, you know, 7 years ago when they won the bid, there was a different set of circumstances.
Absolutely, yeah.
The personal stories from Rio, do you have a couple highlights for you that were, you know, so that when you went to bed that night, you went, that was a really great day, or media caught the young swimmer, female swimmer. I mean, that's a story that we're going to ride anyway. There were so many other stories too. And of course, the young man who is the sprinter and matching up against Usain Bolt. Mr. DeGrasse. So those are the media storylines to draw audience. But you have a whole other set of storylines of the people working together. When you watch it, all that planning come together, and then the athletes attain the level of performance you want. Do you have something back there?
Well, I guess for me, Dennis, one of the great things about these games was the amazing results that our women had. You know, and if you were to look back at some past games, there was a lot of criticism by the media that, you know, our athletes weren't, you know, getting on the podium like the first few days of the games. But these games were a little bit different, that we were hitting the mark pretty frequently. And, you know, our team sports did exceptionally well.
Women's soccer was phenomenal.
Women's soccer, our women's rugby team, first time at the games. That was really exciting to watch, for sure. So many stories, like every single games has something quite unique and special, you know, that I've experienced. A little bit different for me this time around, as I wasn't with the team in the village. I was living outside of the village, and I was working out of our hospitality house. So for me, it was like meeting on a day-to-day basis, family and friends, you know, that traveled all the way to get to the games. I think the story that may have been missed in the media is the number of volunteers, we call them local volunteers, that supported our efforts on site in Rio. Volunteers that fly their way, find their accommodation, feed themselves other than when they're working a shift or whatever, and support us with our efforts, you know, at the games. So we travel with a mission, with a certain number of people that provide athlete services, coaching services, healthcare services, communications. We have professionals in those areas that work full-time with sports or with the Canadian Olympic Committee that provide those services. We complement that with some mission team members who we cover the cost for them to get there, because they're there over the course of a 4-week period. But above and beyond that, we're always looking for volunteers to help us, particularly at our hosting the house, the Canadian Olympic House. And these are people that, as I was saying, they're sort of games gypsies. They go from games to games to games to games. Exactly. And to me, the story is that, you know, that they'll find their way there. They get accommodated, and they support us and help us on site. And you know, they're truly great supporters of the team.
So, do you have a quick anecdote about one of them? Some little high energy moment or a little pop that went, wow, that was really special what just happened?
Oh my gosh, I can't think
There's
of
too many.
anything right
That's
off
like
the
when
bat.
someone goes on a trip and you say, how'd the trip go? And you got 1,000 things and you can't narrow it down to one.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly it. There's just like every day there was something unique and special that was going on. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Yeah.
Well, this might be a good spot for us to pause for a moment, because we take a break in the middle.
Yeah.
We'll be back right after these community announcements. We're here having a conversation with Betty Dermer Norris, who is a game specialist with the Canadian Olympic Committee. And we left off with me asking you, do you have a special moment from some of the volunteers that come and help, or something that happened in the hospitality venue that you know that media would never have covered, but it's one of those powerful, lovely, high-energy moments where something went click and exciting?
Well, I think one of the moments for me was reconnecting with Mark Tewksbury.
Okay.
And Sylvie Bernier. Swimming and diving, of course, medalists from way back when. But they were our chef and assistant chef in London in 2012. And so they both came to the house at different times that morning, but they connected and they hadn't seen each other for quite some time. And I happened to be there as well too, and so it was sort of like a reunion. But what was so unique about meeting up with them was that they were there in the capacity of they were working with the media. So totally different perspective that they had in terms of the games.
Yeah.
And yet the pride that they had, of our athletes and their performances was, elevated that much more, even though they weren't directly connected with the team. And so for me, it's the legacy that gets left behind with some of the leadership that we have and their promotion of our team and what we do in our operation. So it was a really, really great moment to reconnect with the two of them.
That invites a slightly different theme from Olympics, but the whole notion of sport, especially high-end sport or high-performance sport, and the impact it has on a culture.
Right.
Because we'll do the Olympic cycle, media will talk about the business of the Olympics, they'll talk about the amount of money, they'll talk about the television sponsorship, and the scale has changed so drastically. And aside from the business of the sport, but back to the impact, the human connection, attaining excellence, wanting to strive for excellence, and then the impact on a culture. Because our Olympic athletes are part of our Canadian identity now. Might not have been, sort of was the case a while ago, or how do I frame this? So back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, it might not have the same impact that we have today.
Right.
So that never gets spoken about as much as the business of Olympics compared to that pride in the performance of an athlete and how that energy will trickle through all the way from Victoria to Gander.
Right, yeah.
So and your Tewksbury story has elements of that to it.
Yeah, I think for me where I saw a shift in the way the country, a lot of people say we're not really a sporting nation unless you're talking hockey, is totally false,
Yes.
I think. And I think the shift started to happen, probably when we hosted the 1988 games in Calgary.
Yeah.
People that I bump into, my counterparts from other countries still talk about how incredible those games were, specifically the volunteers that worked those games, the energy of the city, what it did for that community. That got elevated in Vancouver in 2010, and I think a lot of people took advantage of hosting those games to promote sport in their communities, to make our athletes well-known named athletes, because we promoted them, 2 years out of the games, not just the 2-week period of the games when they were competing. There were a lot of school programs, getting kids fit again is really critical and off the couch, away from their computers and their cell phones, so there was a real impetus in terms of social awareness in a lot of the communities across Canada. And I think we saw this permeate not only in Vancouver, but I think other organizing committees learned from what we delivered here in Canada and took it to their own countries and their own cities and have been doing the same. And we saw that in Rio. There was a lot of lead up in Rio. With a lot of school programs and social programs in the favelas, in Rio and the poor areas of the country. And so those are the types of legacies that we see are being left behind, which are so, so important.
So following that, the next challenge would be the continuity to it.
Right.
Because Olympics have that big bubble and lots of focused attention, and then there's a down period afterward naturally, because you have to have a down period. But having a population shift its fitness level, for example, which gets into that other discussion about elite sport versus participation recreation stuff.
Right.
And it frustrates me because it's always done as an either or, rather than they mesh together and they complement each other. So that when you've got models of excellence and you know their story, then that becomes an inspiration for many others, which feeds a participation level at the grassroots. Or
Right, right.
has that been your experience with that, or is it still
my
kind of a gap?
experience, and I think the gap is shrinking somewhat. There's still a responsibility, though, for people to understand that a high-performance sport can't do it all for everybody. There's a certain focus. However, municipalities, provincial governments, and so on, also need to look at what their responsibility is too, in terms of overall fitness and health and sport development. And so there is that, I would say, pathway that an athlete will take, but it's widening the base of athletes that is so critical, and it's our Olympians that are basically the heroes, the mentors for youth, to get involved in sport and physical activity. And I think that we have to look at not sport independent of the education system. I think that that's really, really critical, like ensuring that sport and physical activity is in our schools, and not once a week. It should be every single day in our schools.
You know what, a squirrel moment, divergence here. It's fascinating. So much science and study has been done on students' ability to perform in school, connected to having a physical element to the day.
Yeah.
So one will only boost the other. So isn't it fascinating when governments get into decision making, what disappears are arts and music and physical activity. And there's study after study on the musical side that shows what goes on for the synaptic connections with the brain. There's study after study that shows the human body's performance is so much better. The cognitive functions go through the roof once your body is humming and cooking. So it's fascinating why that'll be what we drop, even though we now have enough information to know.
Right.
There was a Facebook post not that long ago about, don't lose it, about why some European countries, Scandinavian countries, are doing so well with school. It's because they didn't assign homework.
Oh.
They want the kids to go out and play.
Yeah. Well, Dennis, I remember a time where, I'd come back from school when I was in grade school and so on. My parents were, huge supporters of physical activity and sport way back then. And we'd come home and drop off our bags, and my mother, shoot us out the door, and we went down to the corner park, and we were playing hopscotch or whatever, Sure, I granted we didn't have the distractions of the computer or television and all that kind of stuff way back then, but I think it's also like the family unit, has to be supportive of that way or style of living, and that philosophy as well too, for the child to grow up and to understand how important it is to have physical activity in their daily lives.
And there's a shift I'd like to make here, because when we frame it up that way, it sounds like, oh, you should be doing this, and you get that sort of sense of obligation. You should have an element of physical activity. But when you describe, I'm home from school, I drop off my book bag, and then I go out to play, it's because it was fun.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that was the motivator, because it was fun.
Absolutely.
And you can have fun when you're 70, and you can have fun when you're 7.
Yeah.
The Olympics help, to me, I thought one of the storylines is the Olympics help inspire the fun of sport, because I don't know, maybe it's just me, but the Canadian storyline is somewhat different from the American storyline. So there is a focus on winning medals. But when this athletes get talking about it, there's a grin in there that's like a 10-year-old grin.
Right.
Even though they're at the peak moment that they've been
Right.
training for, but they got a little bit of that stardust
Yeah.
going, and
Yeah.
that's special.
Yeah.
So do you have a sense of, maybe it doesn't frame up as a question, that all comes together rather than, well, economic argument is we need to drop phys ed. Rather,
Right.
can we just shift it to,
Yeah.
would fun or play be the thing that
Yeah.
brings it back together?
Right.
So were the Olympics, for example, fun?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. I think that the part that people don't see either is what an athlete does outside of the pool or outside of the gym or whatever. And they spend quality time also learning about other sports and going supporting, teammates and whatnot. So they become cheerleaders like everybody else. Or they explore the culture of the city that they're in as well too, which is always good, right? You want to learn a little bit about
Where you
the
are.
community that's hosting you, and so they do make a point of enjoying that aspect as well too. It varies with athletes. Some athletes will do it as they're competing because it's a good outlet to get away from the craziness of the Olympic bubble and get away from media attention and so on. Some athletes prefer not to do anything or enjoy or have the fun until they finish competition, because it becomes a distraction for them. So every athlete
Has their own
reacts to
approach.
it and deals with it, and they make it their own. Yeah,
Different tack. You brought some photos with you.
I did.
Yeah. So you want us, as you remember them, and we'll edit them in as we go. Can you storytell around some of the photos you brought?
Well, probably one of the ones that I've shared recently with some people, because unfortunately this great athlete passed away recently. I was at the 1987 Pan American Games, and they were my first international multi-sport games. And I happened to take a day off I was there as the team manager for our national rowing team. And I had a day to go and explore the city, Indianapolis, which is, the culture of the city was not...
It's different. Well, Kurt Vonnegut
completely
writes...
different.
Yeah, Kurt Vonnegut writes quite well about it. A lot of his roots were there, so...
So I decided to get away from the team, and I just went into town to explore the city and see what was happening, what was going on. There were a few live sites around the city promoting the games and so on, and I happened to be walking near a courtyard and saw a bunch of people standing around and some cheering going on. So lifted my head, and there was this famous person sitting at a table signing autographs and promoting cookies. And he was fundraising for a charity, and of course his picture was on the box, and it was Muhammed Ali. And anyway,
Muhammad Ali cookies.
I couldn't believe that I had left the village without my little camera. We didn't have the cell phones at the time and whatnot. And anyway, so I watched him for a while, and his bodyguard was standing close by, kind of making sure people weren't crowding him. And I had a couple of Canadian pins in my jacket, and I pulled them out, and I tapped on his shoulder, the bodyguard's shoulder, and he said, "Would you mind giving these to Mr. Ali? Tell him it's from somebody from Canada." And he looked at me and with this grin, and he said, "No, not going to do that." And I said, "Oh, okay," and kind of stepped away, and he says, "You're going to do it." And he pulled me through the crowd and brought me right over to the table and introduced me to him, said, "Mr. Ali, this lovely lady from Canada would like to give you a little something." And he stood up, and I showed him the pins, and I went, of course, I didn't know what to say.
Sure.
And I said, "I'd like to give you the pins." And he wasn't, of course, it was at a stage where his Parkinson's, I believe, he had really bad, started kicking in, and he wasn't talking, and he shook his head, and he pulled out his lapel and pointed like this and wanted me to pin it on his lapel.
Very
so
cool.
I had the
So
opportunity.
you pinned
to
Muhammad Ali.
I pinned Muhammad Ali, and he wouldn't let me go until I gave him a peck on the cheek as well. So, anyways, lovely, lovely man. Very humbling experience for those games. For me.
Fascinating too, and the fact how sport can become larger than life sometimes. As the United States goes through its current presidential race,
Right.
through the Facebook world or social media world, there are several clips of Mr. Ali doing news shows talking about being black in America.
Right.
So how fascinating that an athlete, and a unique one in this case,
Right.
has the ability to carry a message that still resonates today.
Today.
And you had a moment there.
With him, yeah. I mean, I didn't really realize that at the time, you know, how incredible that connection was. Now I have a better appreciation for it, for sure. And, you know, I was frustrated, again, as I was saying, I didn't have a camera with me, so you're probably wondering why I have the photos of him, but a photographer that happened to be in the crowd came over afterwards and said, you know, I took photos of you, you know, with all this. I said, oh, really? And he said, yeah. And he said, listen, if you give me a couple of Canadian pins, I'll send them to you. So I figured, don't know this reporter, right? You know, he's freelance and whatnot. I gave him a couple of pins. I thought, oh, I'll never see the photos. And a week after I got back home,
There they were.
package was delivered, and there they were.
Isn't that great?
Yeah.
And years later, you have this story to share with us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Other photos that you brought?
Yes, 1998 Nagano Olympic Winter Games were quite unique and special. Here again, I was a volunteer on the mission team. So people might recall it was the first time that professional hockey was at the games. So had a few moments where I actually met the great one, Wayne Gretzky, and so on. But for me, the storyline that's very fond memory of is the number of New Brunswickers that we had or had a New Brunswick connection at those games. And it was the first games where women's hockey was introduced.
It was an amazing gold medal game, if I remember. Canada overcame a lot of adversity in that game.
Exactly, and the I had the opportunity, or the privilege, I should say, not opportunity, the privilege to get a ticket to the very first women's hockey game at an Olympics, and it was Canada versus Japan. And the starting lineup included Stacey Wilson, Kathy McCormick from both New Brunswickers, as well as Therese Brisson, who was at the time teaching at UNB, and Leslie Redden, who is a student at UNB, who's the goalie for the team. And there they were on the starting lineup. So I didn't realize it at the time, but I took a photo of, you know, they were playing the national anthem before the game. And so that was a special moment as well.
That's great. One other photo you want to?
Well, there are a few photos that I provided to you, and it basically shows a little bit about the operations, you know, in the village, the Olympic Village, and the support that I talked about before, and what we provide, you know, to the team. So you'll see how we do complement, and you'll see there's one photo that shows all the bags, you know, that we pack when we're on site. Some people may not realize this, but there was a time where we used to outfit our team and do a staging with the team in Canada, and then put everybody on the plane and then ship them out to whichever country we were competing in. What we've come to realize is that national sport federations need to do their pre-games training in various countries before they go to the city that's hosting. And so national sport federations have basically said, don't bring us back to Canada just to outfit us and put us on and they have to arrive at different times anyways, right? So the idea of chartering a plane is not in the books for us anymore. So what we decided to do is we actually mobilize a whole outfitting operations, and so we get all of our clothing, we do an inventory in Canada, we pack everything up on skids and pallets, and we ship it down in our cargo, And then we have a team on site that are part of our mission team that will unload, unpack, set up an inventory, a warehouse basically of all this clothing. And then the fun part is with a little shopping cart, and we get basically the sizing of every single team member in advance. So we'll have a sheet of the sizing for that team member. We take the sheet, we take the shopping cart, and we go around and we pull the sizes of every single piece of clothing and we pack them in a bag. And we set up the bags and we wait for the teams to arrive and they get their bags. Not only do they get their bags there, but we also have seamstresses on site so that if something needs to be taken in or hemmed or whatever, it's done automatically. It's amazing to say that clothing becomes a distraction for an athlete. So if they don't get the right size or that's all they think about for 2 days when they should be concentrating on competing, right? So this basically operations, minimizes that distraction again for the athlete, and they feel so proud when they get their kit out, and Canada does a great job. Our outfits are usually one of the first ones that want to be traded.
Yeah, that's what I was going to go with that.
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
The trading element gets pretty high in
Very,
Canada.
very,
has
very
a whole
high.
history of.
Yeah, very, very high. So that gives you an idea. Again, another piece of our operations when we're on site.
So to shift conversation a little bit, for the future, has the Olympic movement, in your sense, gotten too big, or do you even want to speak to that? Because there's some signs like only so many cities in the world now have the ability to host the Summer Olympics anymore. The Winter Olympics are a different story, which gets into a bit of our climate needs, but even that's changing. Is the Olympic movement, it still seems healthy at different levels, maybe not some of that corporate level thing, it might have reached its maximum. But the impact it has on Canada or on other countries, it's a huge motivation and a huge profile, and it gives us that cultural sense. There's a positive energy to it that you can't miss.
Right.
So do you think the Olympics might shift to a slightly smaller size rather than the scale it's gotten, or will it continue on its path? And where's next? Like, what's the next Olympics?
The next Olympics are Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang, South Korea, are hosting those games. And then there's the next Summer Games are in Tokyo in 2020. And you do bring up a good point, and I don't think it's a secret out there, and I know the IOC has had many discussions about this, and they continue to have discussions about it. The number of countries that are bidding to host the games aren't as prevalent as it used to be. It's not as competitive. But I think they're looking at, what are the options? Could some of the, some summer sports be shifted to winter? Like maybe that divide? Because at a Summer Games, you're talking over 204 countries competing versus at a Winter Games where it's closer to 80 countries that compete. You'd get away from the ice and snow concept for sure. At a Winter Games, people aren't too crazy about. But they are looking at, basically what can we do to support cities to make it more palatable for them to host the games. I think probably the biggest challenge in my view, my perspective, is the amount of money that's just spent on security alone at an Olympic Games. So like everything else in the world, things totally shifted after 9/11, but even prior to that, there was the situation where in 1972, the Munich Games and whatnot, and what transpired there changed the focus of how security was viewed at the 1976 Olympics in Montreal. I was a student at those games, and I worked those games, believe it or not, with the organizing committee, and I remember the barbed wire fences going up and having to go through a mag and bag, where they did a total security check of anybody going into the venues or going into the athletes' village. So it started to shift there, but 9/11 was the catalyst, and dramatic catalyst in things changing, not only from an organizational perspective, but even we as a National Olympic Committee and how we view security. We don't take things for granted. We have an emergency response and preparedness plan in place for our team at every single games, and that plan gets looked at every games, and it adjusted based on the situations that might occur in that particular country and whatnot. But I think that to me is something when you look at the costs of hosting any major event, not only the Olympics, but any major event.
Right.
Yep.
So that's the organizational level, and the administration sort of side of it. And then the other side is the athletes' participation in the experience. And
Correct. Yeah.
so it'll sound like it's not connected, but to me it kind of is. Somewhere out there, there must be athletes who just want to go and play and compete, compared to becoming products or promotional product people, or the corporate side of the games compared to just go play. So I wondered if you felt the games actually might slide, now that it's built to this degree, the games might slide to simpler, more focused on just the athlete performance and not so much the corporate sponsorship side, as the counterbalance for the security and stuff, because all of that money and all that attention draws the fear element too, because it's a perfect moment to do something not nice, because you have the world watching.
Right.
But the athletes just want to go on competing and seeing who's best, and finding that performance push by playing against the best.
Right.
So there's kind of two narratives there.
Right.
Think it'll slide to just the athletes going and playing, or will it always have that corporate element to it?
I always have that corporate element. Can't do it without the financial support of the corporate community is paramount. And it's unfortunate, but I mean, that's the way it is. And it's the corporate community provides support, not only direct funding, but in terms of services that they might provide, or programs that they might deliver and whatnot, which are things that basically you don't hear about that much, right? So you go ahead.
Well, we have about a minute left.
Okay.
So what's a fun story to close us out with?
My.
So Betty's view of where the Olympics go in the future in Canada, do we have some rising stars coming that we should be watching out for?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we'll be very successful again in Pyeongchang with our winter team and so on, but the rest of the world is catching up with us, I mean, needless to say. As they did in Rio as well too, with a certain number of our sports. But I don't know where, what the games are going to look like in the future. I hope they continue in some capacity, for sure. We need those everyday heroes in this country. We need those mentors. And I think it's a time, the Olympic Games are a time where the world comes together and stands still, and there's, the focus is on the good.
Yes.
And the wonderful human stories that come out of competition, and we don't have enough of that today. I mean, I turn on television now, and I'm so sick and tired of that election down in the States, or all the negative press and ISIS, and all the bad things that are happening in the world. That it's nice to have good as well too. So I hope the Olympic movement continues for a long time.
Yes. Thank you for this.
It's been great. Thank you.
Lovely conversation.
Great.
And thank you for watching. The Dennis Report can be found on my website, DennisAtchison.com, as well as on the YouTube channel, The Dennis Report. Be good, have fun, and love each other.
Marker, mile marker, count 'em off, son. Between what once was